Hey guys, welcome back to another video. This time we're going to be considering what I call the Lazy Sicilian. So this is not the official name of this opening line. This is called the O'Kelly Sicilian, the O'Kelly variation of the Sicilian Defense. And it's basically a variation of the Sicilian that is suitable for people who doesn't really wish to study a whole that much opening theory against the Sicilian Defense, but still they want to be able to play some sharp Sicilian line that they can enjoy the different possibilities and sharpness that the Sicilian defense has to offer. So what exactly I'm talking about? So after the move e4 c5, the normal Sicilian defense, after the move knight f3, instead of going for the normal moves like knight c6 or d6 or e6, we are going to take a look at this video at the move a6. So this is a very weird looking from first glance, because it looks like black can make much more useful moves than just moving a pawn on the sides of the board on move number 2. But this move has some hidden venom in it, namely it controls the b5 square from the white pieces, which can be very relevant later on, that the bishop cannot come to b5 never, and also the knight at some variations cannot approach the square on b5, as we shall see. At the same point, and the second point is that in some cases it would be also possible to push the pawn to b5 and to b7 as soon as white allows it, and to activate the bishop on b7, which is a fairly common idea in the Sicilian defense. Only here, usually black will do it much quicker than usual. Against the move a6, white has 4 possibilities, namely d4, knight c3, pawn to c4, and pawn to c3. And I will mention that the move c3 is probably white's best move. This is the move that opening theory considers to be the absolute best. But the move that, let's start with the move that most of the viewers are most likely to encounter in their everyday games, which is definitely the move d4, because this is the move that normally Sicilian players play as white even without thinking. So they would assume that after a move like a6, nothing special has changed, so you can just go for the same line, right? But this is not so much the case, because in this case, after we take on d4, white recaptures, we play knight f6, as usual in the Sicilian defense, knight c3. Please pay attention that white cannot actually play the move e5, because of the typical tactic queen a5 check, and black just wins white's pawn in the center for no compensation. So knight f6, knight c3, and now comes this move e5, which is a move you might see very frequently in the Najdorf variation, sometimes in the Sveshnikov variation. But here one very big difference is that white does not have an access to the square on b5. And also another difference is that bishop on f8 is still not being blocked by a pawn on d6, so he still has the option of moving. Against the move e5, obviously white has to retreat his knight, the most active move being knight f5. If white just plays the move knight to b3, which is a little bit more passive, here black can take advantage of the fact that he didn't block his bishop yet by playing bishop to b4, creating this pin against the knight, threatening to capture on e4, getting a free pawn. So white has to play bishop d3 to defend this pawn. And now, in contrast to the normal Sicilian variations, where you usually have a pawn on d6 and then you struggle to push the pawn to d5, here you can actually push your pawn to d5 in one go, using the fact that the knight is pinned and white doesn't really have too much control over the square on d5. So here black is actually just doing very well. So the only move that can be potentially dangerous in this position is knight f5. But here, once again, we take advantage of the fact that the pawn is still on d7, and we can play this move d5 straight away. So this is a rule of thumb to remember in those lines. Whenever you can play d5, you should, especially when white has a knight on f5, because this bishop is now exerting pressure against this knight. Obviously white cannot take on d5, so he must be content with some passive moves, like retreating the knight back to g3. But now black is actually doing extremely well. He is able to push his pawn to d4. The knight is now forced to move into an unfortunate square like e2, and black, I think, is already better. So to conclude, the move d4, which is arguably the most logical move that white has in this position, is already a bad move, or at least inaccurate. This is already a good sign for us when we play the move a6. It means that maybe in 50% of games that you play the move a6 against a club player, you will just instantly get a very good position, even without without thinking too much. Let's see what happens if white plays the move knight c3. This is a better move than d4, because now black basically cannot execute the same idea, and white basically keeps the option of going d4. He just delays it for one move until he will be more ready for it. Against the move knight c3, I suggest to go b5, taking advantage of the fact that we already have a pawn on a6. And now our idea is to very quickly put our bishop on b7, exerting pressure against the white center. I don't think white has too much better to do than just playing d4. And here we can just take on d4. Now if black would play the move e6 in this position, it would be a transposition into the Khan Sicilian, and we don't want to be transposing it to other Sicilians. So I suggest to play the move bishop to b7 here. And our idea on the next moves, for example, if white plays bishop e2, actually probably bishop d3, our idea is now to fianchetto our bishop on g7, playing for that double fianchetto type of formation. So for example, if white castles, bishop g7, what we have in front of us is basically a very good version of the Sicilian defense from black's perspective, because it's a very rare case where black can get both of his bishops fianchettoed in the Sicilian defense without having kind of a penalty for it. So black should be very happy. And if white plays bishop e3, black can choose between many good options. Knight c6 would be a good move, even knight f6 is a good move. And black's plan on the next move is to exert more pressure against white's center with a timely b4, or with a timely d5 break. So this is summarizing the move 3, knight to c3, which is better than going d4, but still not the most critical move that white can play against us. Another kind of clever move is c4, which is also a fairly popular move in this position. White's idea is essentially to try to transpose the game into a Marozzi or hedgehog type of structure. So for example, if black plays a normal move like e6, for example, then white can play d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and we are back into these hedgehog type of positions. There's nothing wrong with playing the hedgehog as black. I like quite a lot playing the hedgehog as black. So if you have some experience playing hedgehog positions as black, you can just do this as black and continue with the scheme of playing knight f6, d6, b6, bishop on b7, knight on d7, and all of those stuff. But if you want to keep the game more in the spirit of the Lazy Sicilian or the equalize Sicilian, you should definitely go knight c6 in this position. Now this is the last moment where white can play d4 without any penalties, because on the next move black might already consider the move e5, stopping the move d4 altogether. So let's say white plays d4, we capture it. And in this position, once again black can go for the same idea, knight f6, knight c3, and try to take advantage of the fact that white doesn't have an access to the square on b5 by playing the move, once again, pawn to e5. So this position is actually very similar into the Sveshnikov Sicilian, for those of you who know the Sveshnikov, just without white's option of going knight b5. If white doesn't play the move knight f5, for example, he retreats his knight somewhere, let's say on c2, then black is just very comfortable. He can play his bishop to c5, and this is a move that black very rarely can do in the normal Sicilian, because normally in the in the more normal Sicilian lines you block that bishop on f8 much earlier on in the game, so you never actually get to develop your bishop so early. And on the next moves, black can play d6, and his bishop on c5 is very well placed. If he ever gets under attack, he can always be hiding on a7, which makes a good use of the move a6. So black should be happy here. So the only move that is bothering us is knight f5, but as you already probably guessed, when we see a knight on f5, we immediately proceed with playing the move d5. The same tactical idea applies also here. Let's say white takes on d5. And in this position, black has two options. The first one is extremely sharp, is to play the move knight takes e4. This move is surprisingly only being played in one game so far, at least from what I can find in the database. And now it leads to a very sharp position, because you see, this is a very rare case where you see basically all of the knights in this position are hanging in some way or another. So this position is a very kind of fertile ground for investigation. The aforementioned game that I found in the database went knight takes g7, intermediate move, bishop takes g7, knight takes e4, knight to d4. I think already black is doing very well. His knight on d4 is very well placed. The knight on e4 is not as stable as our knight, because we can always push it away with a timely f5. And black is just very active. The game went knight c3, castles, bishop d3, b5, a3, f5. And I think I would definitely choose to play black in this position. His knight on d4 is good. The pawn on d5 can be slowly targeted with the moves such as bishop b7. And those pawns in the center looking good. They can always be pushed forward, creating some potential attack on the king side. So really black should be very happy. Or this is the sharp option. Or if black wants to be slightly safer, he can also immediately take on f5, and after e takes f5, go with the move knight d4. Temporarily white is a pawn up, but black is very likely to get his pawn back, either the pawn on f5 or the pawn on d5. Also, he can always add one more attacking unit to the pawn on d5 with the move such as bishop e4. So this position I would evaluate as probably slightly better for white. At some point black will take back his pawn. By the way, there is no reason for white to try to hold on to the pawn with the move such as bishop c4, because then we'll get some tempos attacking this bishop with rook c8 or b5, so there is no need to do that. White's best move is probably a bishop to d3. And at this point black can either immediately recapture his pawn, or what I would do, just continue developing, maybe with bishop c5 or rook c8 or any move like that. Please please pay attention not to play bishop b4 in this position, because then you get into the typical fork with queen a4 check. So bishop takes f5 is the safer move if you want to get into a position without danger of kind of losing immediately, or if you want to get some slightly more interesting and complicated positions. I do very much recommend investigating the move knight takes e4. The scope of this video, which is pretty short, is not allowing me to go too much in depth about this move. But I will leave some variations in the PGN attached to this video. And also I will suggest any viewer wanting to play this line to go over it a little bit by himself with the engine. So let's go back. And now let us consider what is, by theory, is always being suggested as the best move, which is pawn to c3. White basically transposing now the game into a Lapin Sicilian, and he is arguing that his move of knight f3 is more useful than our move of pawn a6. To be completely honest, white is probably correct, and this is a small disclaimer. The Lazy Sicilian is objectively, if white plays all of his best moves, will typically lead to a small advantage for white, but the position is still very much playable for black. And now our job as black is to make use of the move a6 to our advantage somehow. My suggestion is to try and transpose the game into a French defense type of structure with the move e6. The idea is after d4, d5, e5, sorry. This position must be familiar to almost all of us from the French defense. Once again, with that move a6 included, which doesn't seem to be all that useful, but in this position, black does have the option of playing the move bishop to d7, which is actually a pretty typical French defense idea. So in some lines, black will try to exchange his potentially bad bishop on d7, and also in some lines the move bishop d7 just serves as a normal developing move. After the move bishop d7, there were many moves that have been tried in this position. I will not consider all of them because there are just way too many of them, but I will consider what I think are the most important ones. Let's consider first of all the move bishop e3, which is looks fairly logical. White is defending his pawn on d4 while creating some threat of capturing on c5. In this case, we just take on d4, and after the move c takes d4. So the move bishop b5 is in this specific case is actually quite playable in my opinion. It looks a little bit weird at the beginning to play this kind of pawn structure with the two pawns on the b file, but there are some dynamic advantages that this kind of pawn structure giving black. One of them is the open a file that is very useful, and also, for example, if white castles, black can play this fairly annoying move pawn to b4, and this pawn is slightly making white's development not so easy to achieve, because the knight on b1 would typically be happy to go on c3 or maybe even a3 in some variations, but now it's not really possible. So black's position is completely playable here. Other than bishop e3, the move bishop d3 was also played quite frequently. In this position, actually, black should be a little bit careful, because if he proceeds with the plan of bishop b5, then actually white can take on b5, take on c5, play b4. All of this is very much forcing, and after the bishop moves, this move knight a3 is apparently very annoying, and there is no good way to defend the pawn on b5. So actually, black is just losing a pawn here, with some compensation actually, but definitely not enough. After knight e7, knight takes b5, castling. There were some games played from this position, but definitely I think it's not enough to justify the loss of a pawn. So I'm not recommending after bishop d3. In this position, I'm not recommending the move bishop b5. In this position, black, I think, should just go back to his normal French defense type of setup with knight c6 and white castles. Black takes on d4 and plays queen b6. Once again, very much typical French defense stuff, trying to put pressure against that pawn on d4. Some people might try to sacrifice this pawn on d4, but the typical move here would be bishop to c2, enabling the queen to defend the important pawn on d4. And now, thanks to the location of the bishop on d7, we can play this move knight to b4, hunting down his good bishop on c2. Usually white wouldn't want to allow us to take that bishop, so he would go bishop to b3. And now we seize the opportunity to activate our bishop on b5 with a tempo against his rook. Play knight e3, knight takes c1, queen takes c1, knight e7. In this position, I think is quite okay for black. He has the advantage of the two bishops. His knight on e7 is very flexible. He can go to f5, it can go to c6. Our rook is ready to be launched into c8. So black should be pretty happy here. Let's go back to the position after the move bishop d7. And the last move that kind of makes sense to me, which I want to consider, is the move a3, which is also, once again, a pretty standard move in the French defense with the move e5. And now I think the move bishop b5 is actually playable here, because if we compare this position with the other position that we have seen, the move knight a3 is now no longer possible in any variation. So this is actually kind of okay for black. But also I think a move which makes a lot of sense is just to play the move c4, closing down the game kind of, and basically now the fact that black lost the tempo with the move a6 doesn't have too much of meaning, because usually in those lines, in order to play the move c4, black needs to have a queen already on b6, and actually now the queen on b6 is not really needed. So black can play for those ideas that he typically has in the French defense, like knight c6, knight a5, knight b3. Also, he can be thinking about expanding on the queen side with b5, a5, b4, which is an option that doesn't exist normally in the French defense. So this position would be quite okay for black. And once again, for those of you who doesn't want to close up the position and want to keep the position slightly more kind of dynamic, then the move bishop b5 is the move for you. And black will suffer from some very small difficulties with his pawn structure, but his positional compensation would be enough to balance it off. So, hope you enjoyed this small introduction to the Lazy Sicilian. For those of you who want to investigate this opening, I would suggest to do so slightly more on their own, and obviously give it a little bit of practice. And I wish for you to have a lot of good games and victories. See you guys next time. Bye bye.